Hey everyone, today we're gonna make some music with Tone.js. This is the Svelte Safari. Welcome. Today we're gonna create a little step sequencer using the browser's web audio API together with Tone.js. Tone.js is a web audio framework for creating interactive music in the browser. It builds on the back of the browser's built-in web audio API and gives us a really nice and convenient way to create synthesizers, samplers, and sound effects. Step sequencers have been around in hardware form for quite some time now, and the way that they work is that they allow users to create a sequence of notes or sounds by setting steps or stages, each corresponding to some musical note or a beat, which are then played back in a loop, providing a pretty structured but also flexible way to program and modify patterns for music creation. And today we'll create our very own one in the browser using Svelte. Before we get stuck into the code and the functionality, one thing that I like to do is just to take a step back and visualize our end result. Because this is a front-end UI-driven application, I have a little sketch here of the elements we'll lay out on the screen and how they're related to one another. So on first glance, we could see we're gonna have a container div and then have little child divs within that. And it could possibly be structured as rows in a single column, where we set the display type flex and flex direction column on the parent container, and then set the flex direction to row on the row container. But those are quite a lot of divs that will make our code pretty verbose as the number of rows grow. So instead I'm going to remove the rows and use the grid attribute, because after all, this does look pretty much like a grid. Right, so now let's get into the code and get everything set up and installed. To get started, I'm going to use Vite as a build tool and install Svelte with npm by running npm install Vite. Then we'll give our project a name. Let's call it Svelte Step Sequencer. We'll pick Svelte as our framework and then just use the JavaScript variant. We'll change into our directory and install Tone with npm install Tone. And once that's done, we're ready to get into the code. In the source directory, we'll go into the app.svelte file and delete all the boilerplate code. Then I'll create a div to hold the sequencer and a child div to hold our step or our note. In the script tag at the top of the component, I'll create a variable called notes and fill that as an array of 64 items and fill it with a piano for now. Then we'll loop through the array and print out the note. And if we start the server with npm run dev, you should see a long column of little pianos on the screen. We'll fix that with a little bit of styling. On the sequencer container, I'm setting the display type as grid, and then using the grid template to make 16 columns. Okay, so let's take a look. Back in the browser, this is what it should look like. And we can clean it up a little bit and make it a little bit more fun. In the global app.css file, I'll give the body a dark background. Much better. Then I'll empty our fill array and also add or change the background of the note. Alright, sweet. This is looking a lot smoother. Now, one thing I'm going to add is an indication of when the note is active. Then we'll have the background color change. In the component styles, I'll add an active class for the note, give it a background and border of purple-ish, and I'll set a color. I'm not sure I'm going to use it, but this will be good enough for now. Now all that's missing is the logic to set the active class. Here, just for illustration purposes, I'm going to set it to the first item in the array. Sweet, here we have it, the active note. Great, okay, so we're almost there now, but we don't have a way to start or stop the sequencer or to change the BPM, the speed at which it will run. So I'm going to create a little control section. I'll add a label element to hold the BPM, an input range slider to select the BPM, and then two buttons, one for play and one for stop. And there we go, a little section to control our step sequencer. It's a little hard to read the BPM, so let's fix that up. We'll add a CSS class for the BPM controls, give it a bit of a margin, and then we'll set the color of the label to white. Now, while we're at it, let's get that slider to work. So we'll set a BPM variable with an initial value in the component to 120. Then we'll print it out here in the label. Now the value of the range input, or the slider, should be bound to our BPM variable. In Svelte, we do that with bind value and then state the variable that the changed value should be bound to. And that's how simple it is to have reactivity in Svelte. As we change the value of the slider, the BPM updates. Before we move on, I think I'd like to see a little bit more clear demarcation of the bars. That is, having a different background color for the first beat of the bar. In our CSS, I'll add a class for the first beat of the bar with a light blue background. Then in the notes loop, I will add an expression to check if the iterator I modulo 4 is 0 or not. Basically, it means that if the iterator I modulo 4 is not 0, i.e. I is not a multiple of 4, the expression will evaluate to an empty string. If I modulo 4 is 0, meaning that it is a multiple of 4, the expression evaluates to the string first beat of the bar, which is our class where we've set our styles. And that means that this class is applied to the element every 4 iterations when I is a multiple of 4. And that gives us this beautiful visual, and we know exactly where the beginning of each bar is. But now I think I'm pretty happy with the UI. Of course, we could make things look a lot fancier, and maybe we will later on. But right now I want to understand the data structure and the logic that we need to put together to make this UI come alive and start making music. Now let's have a look at our data structure. Each row on the grid will be mapped to a single note on a musical scale. For example, here we have a couple of notes from the Dorian scale which play well together. Then on the x-axis we have a time scale, each column representing a step that the sequencer will move through at a rate of a certain value of beats per minute, where each step represents a beat or a fraction thereof. Then each little block in a row will represent a note object with a string value for note and a Boolean value for active. When a user clicks a note, then we will tell the sequencer that that note for that step should be played. Otherwise, if false, should not be played. So let's put that all together now. We have an array of arrays where the grid is represented by rows, and each row in the grid is represented by an array of notes, where every note has a note value and an active value. So I think this makes sense. Let's go and test it out and see what happens. Back in the app component, I'm going to import tone. Then I'm going to construct some synths, put them in an array, and initialize each one with new tone.synth and add the toDestination to add it to the output. Then we'll need 4 of them because we'll have 4 notes, and those notes we'll put in an array called scale of notes. And these are the Dorian scale of notes that should play pretty well together. Next up, I'll create the array of arrays, which we'll call rows, with every child array containing notes with a note value from the Dorian scale. Now I want our bottom row to have the lowest note and our top row to have the highest note in the scale, so I'll order these arrays accordingly. Now that we've put our notes in the rows array, we can do away with our previous note variable. And that means that we need to go back into the HTML and make some changes. First, we'll loop through all the rows as row, and then for each row, we'll iterate through the notes. We'll change our div to a button instead, so that we can add on some on-click functionality. Now we'll create the functionality for our sequencer to step through the beats, and we'll use the tone transport schedule repeat method for that. This allows us to schedule an event every 16th note. In the callback, we'll loop through the rows, and then for each one, we'll load a synth, grab the note, and if the note is set to active, we'll trigger the synth to play the note. Finally, we'll increment the beat value and reset it after every 16th iteration. Now we just need a way to start and stop the transport, as well as update the BPM when it changes. We'll create an isPlaying variable that we can set and check to see the status of the transport. Then we'll create 3 functions, one to handle the note click, the other to handle the play click, and then finally the stop click. The handle note click will take 2 arguments, one with the row index, the other with the note index, and then we'll simply toggle the active attribute on the note. To handle the play click, we'll have to check if we need to start the audio context, and then we'll set the BPM and start the transport. To handle the stop, we'll simply stop the transport and then set isPlaying to false. One thing to note though is if we change the BPM value after hitting play, the transport BPM value will not update. So to enable that, we'll use Svelte's built-in reactivity statement to update the transport BPM value if the transport is playing. Now let's tie the functionality to the UI. We'll replace the existing play stop buttons with one button depending on whether is playing is true or false. Then we'll tie the handle note click function to the note button. And let's make sure that our active class is tied to the active value of the note. And while we're here, let's make sure that we reference the correct iterator for the first beat of the bar class. Okay, and now let's have a look at what we've created. Let's click in a few notes, one for every bar, hit play, and hey! There we go, we have our step sequencer. Now we can add in a few more notes, create some variety, and a couple more. And now we have a little melody. There we go, our basic step sequencer is pretty much done. Now, the last thing I'd like to add is to have a little indicator to see where the beat actually is as the sequencer is playing. Let's head back to our app component and add that in. Just below our rows declaration, we'll declare an array of beat indicators with a length of 16, and then we'll just fill them with the index. Then in our markup, we'll just iterate through them, creating a div with the class beat indicator, and then here we'll check whether the beat is active or not and set the class to live. We'll need to add those classes in our CSS, with the live class going green on the active beat. Now when we hit play, we can clearly see where the beat is, and if we change the BPM, we see that the indicators speed up, we see them slow down, and that's working perfectly. And with that, let's wrap up this week's episode. Thanks for sticking all the way to the end. You can find the code on GitHub. If you like this video, share it and subscribe for more. And if you found this content valuable, you're welcome to drop a donation of any amount you feel equal to the value of this content. Next week, we'll have another video right here on the Svelte Safari.